Vamos começar agora a segunda conferência da nossa tarde com o professor Dilworth. We will now begin our second conference with Professor Dilworth. Welcome to the 24th International Meeting on Pragmatism. Professor, with you. We're going to open his paper. Can you hear us, Professor?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You can begin.
Okay. I'm the ghost in the machine. My title is Materialism Without Flinching, Behind the Pleasure Principle in Freud, Peirce, and Wallace Stevens. Are you going to move you will recognize that materialism without flinching is Peirce's words inscribed in the opening prospectus of A Guess at the Riddle. I propose here to enlist the genius of Freud under the same intriguing heading. Peirce and Freud, strange bedfellows. I think that rather older and younger brothers, so to speak, who have arguably contributed more than most other philosophers in our modern times to the broad assessment of what civilization is and should be and what we can be doing in it. In my very limited experience, I know of such studies relating Peirce and Freud. The specialized identity politics agendas of our contemporary scholastic workshops be damned. I propose here to assign myself the possibility of finding significant points of convergence between Peirce and Freud, specifically on the foundational semiosis of civilization itself, and so on to its force multipliers, science and art, considerations which turn out to involve, in Freud's famous construal, the ego ideals of civilization in the perspective of the pleasure principle and the death instinct. Part 1, the story of my life. To launch this theme, let me serve up certain pleasurable lines of Shakespeare. How like a Yanka or a prodigal, the scarfed bark put from her native bay, hugged and embraced by the strumpet wind. How like a prodigal doth she return, with over-weathered ribs and ragged sails, lean, rent, and begged by the strumpet wind. You will recall, the strumpet wind, what a board of polysemic euphony. You will recall that Peirce cited the same lines in his initial articulation of his three categories in A Guess at the Riddle. Shakespeare's lines, in fact, can be read as illustrating all three of the categories. Peirce, however, presuming the Shakespearean education of his readership, concentrated on the hard lesson of the ship's overweathered and ragged sails, in illustration of his category of secondness, reality's dimension of brutal, interactive otherness. He left out Shakespeare's salacious synergy of the strumpet wind, itself a rare intra-verse repetition in the protocols of English poetic style. Now let us imagine Freud reading the same lines, and Freud was an avid reader of Shakespeare. Had Freud the occasion, he would have jumped on the same lines, commenting on the sexual nuance of the strumpet wind, which captures Shakespeare's bawdy euphony and fuller libidinal nuance, to wit, Q for his psychodynamics of the equi-primordial powers of Eros and Thanatos, which traces a world of pleasures and pains, frustrations, renunciations, and sublimations of life's ineluctable necessities of hunger and love, or ego libido and object libido, traces them down to our race's phylogenetic inheritance in the Oedipal complex. Well, the poor Yonka prodigal stands for each of us. Battered ship, bruised ego, the story of my life, and perhaps of everyone's life. Men made out of words, how would we be without the sexual myth, the human reverie, or poem of death? Castrados of moonmesh. Life consists of propositions about life. The human reverie is a solitude in which we compose these propositions, torn by dreams, by the terrible incantations of defeats, and by the fear that defeats and dreams are one. The whole race is a poet which writes down the eccentric propositions of its fate. Part 2, Catastemic Pleasure, Nirvana, and the Neo-Cartesian Epoche. In this brief presentation, I, of course, cannot explicate Freud's full metapsychological theory inscribed in his Beyond the Pleasure Principle and other late-phase classics. My limited hermeneutic will focus on certain considerations of bio and cosmosemiosis on which Freud and Peirce arguably converged. First, let me stretch the subject of pleasure and pain to analogous issues in ancient philosophies of East and West. Food for thought, take the ancient concept of ataraxia, life's putative possibility of achievement of a consummate non-disturbance of mind, versions of which were front and center moral claims in the schools of the skeptics, Epicureans, and Stoics. Epicurus, for one locus classicus, postulated a distinction between the stormy kinetic pleasures and such a halcyon catastemic pleasure, the latter a kind of quiescent libido as the existentially realizable telos of the ethical life. Epicurus' semiosis of catastemic pleasure as life's consummate telos appears to conflate, if not override, his predecessor Aristotle's distinction between pleasure, hedone, and happiness, eudaimonia. Aristotle, for his part, rejected the conflation, as in the early passage of the Nicomachean Ethics. Quote, these bad effects of pleasure and pain are the reason why people actually define the virtues as ways of being unaffected and undisturbed by pleasure and pains. They are wrong, however, because they speak of being unaffected without qualification, not of being unaffected in the right or the wrong way, at the right or the wrong time, and the added qualifications. As well as in the extended analyses in Book 7 and again in Book 9, where Aristotle devoted the first 6 chapters to pleasure and the last 3 chapters to happiness. Well, this classical confrontation between Aristotle and Epicurus on the nature of pleasure and happiness was a force multiplier of signification in the world history of philosophy. For a conspicuous resemblance, the telos of the moral life inscribed in Epicurus' telos of epistemic pleasure finds innumerable analogs in ancient Eastern religious moral claims as to a blissful, non-backsliding enlightenment, realized in a transcendental freedom from life's kinetic pleasures, actions, and anxieties. It was the common coin of Hindu yoga and Buddhist ascetics to claim such a nirvana condition freed from the karmic or samsaric world of pleasures and pains. They practiced what Freud called an ethics of quietude and retirement from the world, as did practitioners over centuries of medieval Christian monasticism, not to mention such post-medieval icons of saintly asceticism as Blaise Pascal. But let me stretch the historical analogies further. Such a claim of libidinal quiescence, epistemic and moral arguably functions as well in modern strategies of epoche, notably in contemporary phenomenologies, putative bracketing out, or suspension of judgment of the natural attitude, ministrant to neo-Cartesian a priorism, a putative transcendental reductionism opening a noetic life world of essential intuitions of the stamp, in some instances fueling a morality and politics of virtue signaling in contemporary continental philosophy. The provenance of this style of epoche appears to trace to Descartes' deployment of his cogito ergo sum, overriding common experiences sum ergo cogito, programmatically to launch an epoche which brings all possibilities of sensible belief under suspicion. Descartes accomplished such a finesse d'esprit, a veritable firewall of transcendental consciousness, in his first meditation, followed by a solipsistic affirmation of his own finite thinking substance in the second meditation, then followed by his third meditation, discovery of a second purely innate, infinite thinking substance, so as to allow him finally to say he is no longer alone in the world. Needless to say, Descartes' epoche of epistemic introversion into a pure immediacy of an a priori immaterial ego consciousness reprised the mainstream Platonic and Neoplatonic paradigm of the soul's anamnesis of a transcendental origin of divine intelligence and numeral intelligibility. That is to say, modeled the possibility of an epistemic and moral introversion beyond our experiential world of sum ergo cogito. Peirce, however, pointedly in such early essays as Some Consequences of Foreign Capacities, The Fixation of Belief, and How to Make Our Ideas Clear, launched his own career in direct rebuttal of Descartes' paper doubt, and indeed in wholesale eschewal of every a priorism of fixing belief and claims of knowing things in themselves. For the laboratory-minded Peirce, as we will see also for the clinically minded Freud, there are no a priori, no pure essences, no such transparent points of departure or return. Only the hard-fought, painfully achieved results of empirical, fallibilistic, open-ended, ever-sublimating scientific inquiry and conduct of life, including the kairos moments of artistic creation and aesthetic appreciation in civilization's hopeful, progressive confrontations with the objective world. In this matter of what I call his objective empirical perspective, Peirce relegated the private claims of mystics to the first of his four methods of fixing belief, the method of subjective tenacity. The mystics' claim consisted of a kind of catastemic emotional interpretant that also historically tended to be retailed via a second method of fixing belief, namely by external intimidations of fire and sword of church and state. But then, in Peirce's analysis, such dogmaticized claims as to an authoritative consciousness could gain a third life in a shared method of a priorism, achieved in rationalized philosophical systems, as represented by Descartes and Hegel, among others. Part 3, the modern riddle of the universe. Peirce's pragmatism, later renamed pragmaticism, featured scientific fallibilism that predicated a realistic, idealistic theory of unvarnished consequential intelligence. And back to Freud. For his part, Freud converged exemplarily with Peirce's refutation of Cartesian a priorism. In like manner and intent, his brilliantly questing retroductive career texts, which culminated in his late phase metaphysical classic, The Ego and the Id, programmatically undercut the epoche firewall. of a self-clarifying ego consciousness. In his following classic, The Future of an Illusion, he challenged the finesse d'esprit of epoche and the entire historical panorama of the world religions as a universal obsessional neurosis of illusioned ego consciousness. Peirce's scientific fallibilism had in effect already moved epistemic and moral consciousness along the same path. As concrete application of these epistemic and onto-semiotic issues central to the critical text of Peirce and Freud, let us ask, in what way could the epoche of phenomenological introversion confirm or improve upon the paleontologist's empirical discovery of the evidence that the Neanderthals buried their dead? Such evidence, itself fallible, corrigible, cannot be obtained on any a priori basis. And more generally, how can phenomenological introspection of a pure noetic immediacy of enlightened ego consciousness comprehend Freud's death instinct in the account of real life and extinction of life? A death instinct which flourishes outwardly and inwardly, loudly and silently, as in neurotic and psychotic pathologies of character, personal and societal, as well in history's diseases, famines, the Black Death, and in our contemporary world's aggressive manifestations of criminality, violence, the horrors of war, genocide, slavery, sadistic cruelty. And how indeed must the modern scientific and philosophical consciousness configure the relations between eros and thanatos? Are they to be conceived as coexisting and in an eternal Empedoclean tension, as Freud spoke ambivalently in the concluding words of Civilization and its Discontents? Or is it possible, as he also seems to have professed, the force of eros or libido, love, that is an evolutionary present principle, may still be prioritized as the more effective cause? Which is further to ask, while Freud's agonistic dialectic of eros and thanatos does play such an incessant role in every one of the zillion particular life processes existentially realized or conceivable, how does it account for the spiral ascendancy to higher and higher forms of intensification and complexification of mental life over the billions of years of lithospheric, biospheric, and noospheric evolution? So much more needs to be said and elaborated, of course, but let me search for a briefest conclusion here. I read Peirce and Freud as undercutting both ancient and modern epistemes of catastemic pleasure or of epoche in their rejection of a priori strategies of transcendental phenomenological introspection, rather in favor of realistic, idealistic disclosures of the ineluctable tangle and challenges of kinetic pleasure and pains in life and mind, and thus as well in favor of their hopeful projection of the reasonable possibilities of realizations of the higher ego ideals of civilization, notwithstanding its discontents. At first blush, Peirce's categorically elaborated tritism of bio and cosmosemiotics, which he framed in terms of the ontological gospel as teaching of God is love and light, and then in terms of Lamarckian type irreversibility of psychic causation and evolutionary love, could be said to transcend Freud's thematics of civilization and its discontents. However, Freud's late phase writings clearly parallel Peirce's own late-phase theoretical agenda in his dynamics of humanity's ego-ideals and their open-ended possibilities of energetic reasonableness in futuro. So apart from this complicated matter of comparative hermeneutical convergences, what is essential is to recognize that Peirce's and Freud's career texts shared the same bottom line archic semantic principle of pragmatistic reflexive rationality. That is to say, a poetic, scientific power of heuristic, uh, I think, of heuristic abductory proactive intelligence that partakes of the phylogenetic inheritance of evolutionary intelligence. Freud's The Future of an Illusion is perhaps his most affirmative statement of his semiosis of such sense-governing principle of intrinsic anthropomorphic rationality and his power to overcome the universal obsessional neurosis of religious infantilism, paralleling paralleling Peirce's rejection of nominalistic metaphysical systems, and both ministrant to promoting human rationality's replacement of illusions of belief by such culturally prospective ego ideals, both phylogenetically inherited and operative in human nature. For understandable historical reasons, Freud couched his economical and dynamic model of id, superego, and ego in materialistic terms, derived, he said, from Fichte and Helmholtz. But in the sense governing principles of his text, Freud was no materialist. His metapsychology was pro-ontologically, idealistically therapeutic. He shared what he called the twin gods of Ananke and Logos with Peirce, and indeed with their predecessor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose lead essay, Fate of the Conduct of Life, in 1860, bottomed out in his own twin Heraclitean principles of fate and power in regard to the potencies of unvarnished, self-reliant anthroposemiosis of civilization's ego ideals. Part 4, and last part. Civilization's esthétique du mal. Freud speaks for Peirce when at the beginning of chapter 2 of Civilization and its Discontents, he cites Goethe. Der Wissenschaft und Kunst besitzt, hat auch Religion. Wer jede beide nicht besitzt, der habe Religion. Okay, and the translation is in the footnote there. He who possesses science and art also has religion, but he who possesses neither, let him have religion. Okay. In the spirit of Goethe's words, I suggest our appreciation a double reality of the present principle. First, the pleasure principle to which the death instinct is ineluctably alongside of the insights in every existential and conceivable process of life and mind. And second, a veritable esthétique du mal, Wallace Stevens, that trends beyond that tension in the upward ascendancy of evolutionary life and mind as manifested in a scientifically discoverable evolutionary ascent of bio and cosmosemiosis, and thus again as central to Peirce's thematics of the energetic reasonableness of evolutionary love. Not only in the great paradigm breakthroughs of scientific intelligence, the dominance of the pleasure principle underwrites all the literary, artistic, musical, architectural classics of world civilization. So, for example, we easily conceive of the career musical texts of Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, or the 700 pages, 700 songs of Stephen Forster as such expressions of cultural ego ideals. Goethe's apotheosis of science and art expands indefinitely in appreciation of civilization's immortal works, in which we are called to participate in our own sublimations of libido. To end then on a freewheeling, pleasurable note, I recommend appreciating the philosophical implications of an aesthetique du mal, qua dominance of the pleasure principle, in a variety of Wallace Stevens' poems, which express his signature theme of death is the mother of beauty. Consider, for one, the profoundly mysterious lines of his The Pleasure of Merely Circulating, as capturing the essential semiosis of Peirce's evolutionary love and Freud's sense of the future possibilities of civilization. The pleasure of merely circulating. The garden flew round with the angel. The angel flew round with the clouds. And the clouds flew round, and the clouds flew round, and the clouds flew round with the clouds. Is there any secret in skulls? The cattle skulls in the woods? Do the drummers in black hoods rumble anything out of their drums? Mrs. Anderson's Swedish baby might well have been German or Spanish, yet that things go round and again go round has rather a classical sound. By the way, I can't have not saying the famous query of Freud about what does a woman want, which he said he was working on for 30 years. It's in that poem. And one more thing. Let me finally venture to suggest that the cosmopoetical hold on. Okay, one more page. Let me venture to suggest that the cosmopoetical satisfaction of Stephen's poem resonates with one of the philosophical articulations of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Quote, perceiving that we are alive is pleasant in itself. For life by its nature is good, and it is pleasant to perceive that something good is present in us. Living is also choice-worthy, and for a good person most of all, since being is good and pleasant for him, he is pleased to perceive something good in itself together with his own being. In pursuing the implications of that resonance, we might now also reconsider Shakespeare's trumpet wind. That is poetic metaphor for Peirce's category of secondness and for Freud's eros and thanatos. In the way Aristotle defines evil, not as a distinct entity, but as a privation or absence of good, which is inherently self-destructive and unsustainable. For life is by nature good. Pain and evil encompass things that hinder or destroy pleasure and happiness, such as aggression, envy and hate, vice and criminality, weakness of will, bodily decay, and external misfortunes. They are, in Peirce's phrase, secondary phenomena, and carry the seeds of their own ruin in contrast with life's good seeds. In Freud's terms, life is too hard, has too many pains, except for the good seeds, the ego ideals of higher civilization, which blossom, as Goethe said, in the inheritance and achievements of science and art. Science, in the form of powerful deflections, sublimating generalizations of intellectual interests, as in solving problems and discovering new truths in humanity's life and death struggles. And art, in the precious forms of the mordant tooth of Kronos, temporarily surrendering to Kairos, the pleasurable moments of rich fantasy. That's the end.
We want to thank you, Professor Dilworth, for this inspiring conference, and now proceed to questions. And whoever would like to ask a question, if they could proceed to near the camera so that Professor Dilworth can see you. Para quem quiser fazer pergunta, pode se dirigir aqui atrás para que o professor possa vê-los, porque é a câmera que estamos usando. Se virar e estiver aqui na parte de cima, pode ver sim, o professor. You can turn around, Professor Vincent.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Hello, David.
Hello.
It's good to hear you. Good to see you. I hate to do this, but I'm going to burst your bubble. You are not the first to write about Freud and Peirce. There's actually
good to hear.
What? There's actually
good to hear that.
There's actually literature on this. Teresa de Lauretis, Lucia Santaella, Elizabeth Saporiti, Vincent Colapietro, and several other people. So, but you're in a lineage, and now you know that. That's good. So the second thing, I think the much more important thing is, I love this, a very suggestive talk, the kind of talk I love. But it seems to me that we cannot end with the obvious, but we might perhaps begin with the obvious. And Peirce focuses upon agape, and Freud focuses upon eros. And I think what they mean by those terms overlaps, perhaps quite significantly, but I don't think they're identical in meaning. So I think to do what you want to do, we need to tease out in a more nuanced way the Peircean meaning of agape and the Freudian meaning of eros, and then and only then see just how close together they are.
Thank you very much, Vince. And I will have to work on it because it's a great question. But when I turned in the last part to esthétique du mal, I tried to suggest a generalization in which eros and agape come closer together. That's the whole point of the part 4.
It's one thing to say it, you need to show it. I got that, David. I got that. I know you were trying, but saying and showing are two different things. You said that, and I think you hinted at how it might be shown. My only suggestion is more work needs to be done in the showing of the affinity between the Peircean agape and the Freudian eros. That's my only suggestion.
Temos mais alguma pergunta?
Olhar para quem? Para você?
We're going to give you a question in Portuguese, and I'll translate it.
Ok. Professor, no senso que você liga a época entre Peirce e Freud, dá para dizer que a metapsicologia freudiana é uma espécie de epistemologia da descoberta, como em Peirce?
Professor, in the sense that you are connecting the relation of Peirce and Freud to their critique or of epoche, would you make an approximation between the metapsychological theory of Freud and the Peirce's theory of inquiry?
Okay, perfect.
Yes, I thought I had made that approximation. And get back to Vince Calapierre, Vince's question. I would push this idea of civilizations aesthetique de mal all the way back to Spinoza. I think I pushed both Peirce and Freud back to Spinoza, and especially the book 5 of the Ethics. Civilization, in this broadest possible sense of the intellectual love of God, is part of the God's love of himself. It's a long haul. I agree, and I have to work it out.
We thank you, Professor. Another question. Do we have any more questions? Okay, Professor Oh, one more.
I would like to congratulate my dear friend David for this so inspiring paper and inspiring the sense of many questions will arise from your paper. So you are from now invited to publish with us this paper in our journal Cognitio. I'm quite sure that many people will read it and will reflect on the deepness of your reflection and your tentative of connection between poetry, philosophy, Freud, Peirce, Wallace Stevens. So it was a beautiful speech, and we are deeply thank you for this. And receive our big hug. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Pode encerrar, viu? Não tem mais coisa.
And so with this, we conclude our conference for today, and we thank you, Professor Dilworth. Assim, concluímos a nossa conferência de hoje. Obrigado a todos.
Thank you.